The United Nations Human Rights Commission issuing a report earlier this month detailing concerns of certain groups and how they're being treated in the United States, including people living stateside near the U.S.-Mexico border.
Beth Wood introduces us to those who live in those border towns. She also talks to a state senator who visited the border.
4 generations ago, Lillian Serrano's ancestors settled in the area just north of the Mexico border. She testified at the UN last month.
What I'm describing to you is what I see. A place where we want to have our families and grow. And it's a place where we welcome newcomers and people from all over the world.
She's concerned about what politicians see when they visit the border.
Decision makers with Border Patrol, who has very good lobbyists who have been very successful at ensuring that by portraying the border as this place of chaos, the agency continues to receive unchecked funding.
Giovanni Sebastian Hernandez also testified to the UN. He says checkpoints within the U.S. have legal citizens questioning whether they want to travel outside of their own hometowns because they could be detained by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He describes a 52-mile stretch between Las Cruces, New Mexico, and El Paso, Texas.
These two cities, with close to 1.5 million people, are surrounded by 6 CBP checkpoints. If I wish to visit my family in a different city, I have to go through these checkpoints. I have to be asked questions about who I am, where I come from, whether or not I'm a citizen, just because of maybe the way I look, my last name, the color of my skin, what have you. And this is not an experience that's unique to me.
Senator Casey Crabtree visited the border with other lawmakers. We asked about the claim of racial profiling of legal citizens within the U.S. carried out by the CBP.
We didn't see that when we were there or these checkpoints, but what I would say is there's absolutely no room for racism or anti-Semitism or these types of actions anywhere in our country.
Whether it's at or near the border,
I saw an entire process that was completely broken. And so I would just tell you, there is no policy down there on the border that is working correctly right now.
Regarding politicians sending troops to the border,
sending another occupying military force to our homes. Are you joking, right? Racist policies that perpetuate a culture of fear for people who live nowhere near to the border and know nothing what the daily experience is like, right? I think all this does really to serve is to flame the base within their own home states and to perpetuate lies about what it's like here.
Crabtree believes change needs to start from Washington and that all need to be treated fairly.
And be part of the United States of America and live the same dream. Right now, none of those policies are working.
In Sioux Falls, Beth Warden, Dakota News Now.
The UN does not have the authority to mandate change, but it does highlight issues on the world stage. In the past, the U.S. and other countries being questioned responded with plans on how improvements will be implemented.